Marjorie, a kitchen slave at Willow Creek Plantation, who burned the Thanksgiving table in 1850s Mississippi. She was a slave at Willow Creek Plantation, somewhere deep in the suffocating heat of the American South, where the air hung thick with mosquitoes and unspoken terror. For nearly 2 decades, she had been the invisible architect of luxury, her calloused hands building feasts for people who believed she had no soul. But on one cold Thanksgiving evening in the 1850s, Marjorie did something that would haunt that plantation forever. She burned the Thanksgiving table, and as the flames consumed the centerpiece of her master's pride, he choked on the ashes of his own arrogance. This is the story of how a woman with no power found the only weapon she had left. Fire. The morning of that Thanksgiving arrived under a pale gray sky. Frost clung to the windows of the main house like skeletal fingers. Inside the kitchen, the air shimmered with heat. Cast iron pots bubbled over open flame. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the sharp scent of burning hickory. Marjorie moved through the controlled chaos with the precision of someone who had learned that mistakes could mean blood. Beyond the kitchen door, the dining hall waited in silence. The long oak tables stretched beneath the light of a dozen candles, draped in pristine white linen that seemed to glow. Silver utensils gleamed. Crystal glasses stood at attention like soldiers. Everything is perfect. Everything is excessive. Everything built on the backs of people who would never be allowed to sit down. The master's family would gather here tonight to celebrate abundance. Abundance they had stolen. Abundance they had never earned. Marjorie had seen this ritual before. Year after year, the same prayers of gratitude from mouths that had never known hunger. The same laughter echoing through halls built by enslaved hands. But this year, something inside her had crystallized into something cold and certain. This year, the table would not hold a feast that this year, before the sun set on Thanksgiving. This table, built to celebrate abundance, would become the altar of a burning reckoning. Willow Creek Plantation was an empire of cruelty disguised as civilization. It sprawled across the landscape like a stain, hundreds of acres of cotton fields stretching toward a horizon that offered no escape. At the center stood the master's house, 2 stories of painted wood and false grandeur, designed to project wealth and respectability to anyone who might be watching. But behind that facade lived the truth. Behind the house stood the smokehouse, where meat cured in salt harvested by enslaved hands. The storerooms, filled with grain threshed by enslaved backs, bent double in the fields. The quarters, where families slept on splintered wood and dirt floors, their bodies broken by labor that would never end. Every single brick of prosperity at Willow Creek had been laid by people who were treated as livestock. And the kitchen, Marjorie's prison, was the engine room of it all. This was where raw suffering transformed into spectacle, where yams were candied with stolen sugar, where turkeys were stuffed and basted until their skin glistened like bronze, where pies cooled on windowsills, their crusts golden and perfect, while the people who baked them received only scraps. The Thanksgiving table was the crown jewel of this theater of domination. Every year it became a monument to inequality. The master sat at its head, his chest puffed with pride. His wife preened beside him. Their children, pale and soft from lives spent idle, gathered around. Guests arrived from neighboring plantations, eager to admire the display. Roasted turkey, buttered cornbread, cranberry sauce glistening like rubies, gravy boats filled to the brim, platters piled so high they seemed to defy gravity, and in the quarters, the enslaved received cold cornmeal, mush, and fatback. If they were lucky, the contrast was not accidental. It was architectural. It was designed to remind everyone of their place in the hierarchy. The dining hall was more than a room. It was a stage where power performed itself, where the master's family could pretend their wealth came from virtue rather than violence, from hard work rather than human trafficking. Marjorie had been forced to watch this performance for years. standing in doorways, carrying platters, refilling wine glasses while her own stomach cramped with hunger. She knew every inch of that room, every floorboard, every window, every candle. What the family saw as celebration, Marjorie saw as a stage, and stages burn. Marjorie had not always been silent. There had been a time, decades ago, when she still believed that compliance might earn mercy, when she thought that if she just worked hard enough, obeyed fast enough, stayed invisible enough, maybe the master would see her humanity. Willow Creek had beaten that hope out of her slowly, methodically, like tenderizing meat. She had spent nearly 20 years in that kitchen. She knew its rhythms the way a prisoner knows the sound of approaching footsteps. Wake before dawn, while stars still pierced the darkness. Light the fires with hands stiff from cold. Knead bread dough until her knuckles ached and bled. Pluck chickens until feathers stuck to her arms like a second skin. Stir pots over open flame until the heat left permanent scars on her forearms. Burns layered on top of burns. A map of suffering written on her flesh. And always, always, the knowledge that she was creating luxury she would never be allowed to touch. The psychological cruelty was the worst part. It wasn't just hunger. It was being forced to perfect a roasted duck, to make sure the glaze shone just right, to arrange garnishes with artistic precision, all for people who saw her as subhuman, to prepare Thanksgiving feasts, celebrating family and gratitude, while her own family had been sold off, scattered to plantations she would never see. She had survived by learning to read the house like a book written in violence. She learned the master's moods in the set of his jaw, learned when to vanish into corners, learned when a beating was coming based on the tone of a voice 3 rooms away. Survival meant becoming a ghost in her own life, but ghosts remember, and ghosts carry rage. Beneath her mask of obedience, Marjorie had been keeping a ledger. Every insult, every slap, every Thanksgiving where she had stood in that doorway watching the master's family gorge themselves on food, her hands had made while she went to bed with an empty stomach. She had been bent by this life, shaped by its cruelty. But she had not been broken, and this year, something had shifted. A line had been crossed somewhere deep inside her, in a place the master could never reach. But this year, she would not stand in the kitchen doorway and watch them laugh. This year would be different. There was no single blow that broke Marjorie. It was not one insult, one beating, one moment of humiliation that finally pushed her over the edge. It was the weight of years, the slow accumulation of 1,000 degradations stacked, so high they finally collapsed under their own gravity. The master had never seen Marjorie as human, not once, not ever. She was property, a tool that cooked, something to be used, commanded, and discarded when it wore out. But Thanksgiving made the cruelty unbearable. Every year, the holiday arrived like a mockery wrapped in religious hypocrisy. The family gathered around that long table, heads bowed in prayer, voices raised in gratitude to God for blessings they had stolen. They thanked the Lord for their health, their prosperity, their family unity. They never mentioned the people who had made it all possible. The people standing in the kitchen doorway with empty stomachs. The people who had planted the yams, threshed the wheat, slaughtered the turkey, baked the pies. The people whose families had been torn apart so the master's family could stay together. The contradiction was suffocating. To be forced to create a celebration of gratitude while having nothing to be grateful for. To prepare a feast symbolizing abundance while being denied even basic nourishment. To watch a family give thanks for unity while your own children had been sold downriver like cattle. And the master, God, the master, sat at the head of that table every year like a king, his face flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, his voice booming with laughter, his eyes sliding over Marjorie like she was furniture. He loved that table, loved the way guests admired it, loved the way it made him look prosperous and generous and civilized. He had no idea how much Marjorie hated it, How many years of rage had been simmering beneath her silence, building pressure like a covered pot left too long over the flame. This Thanksgiving, the pot finally boiled over. Everyone has a line, and on this Thanksgiving Marjorie reached hers. Marjorie did not need to find a weapon. She had been working with fire for 20 years. The kitchen was an arsenal, if you knew where to look. Open flames crackling in the hearth, grease pooling in cast iron pans, candles stored in wooden cupboards, linens that caught flame as easily as kindling, barrels of cooking oil, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling like fuses waiting to be lit. Her plan did not require elaborate scheming. It required only familiarity with the tools she had been forced to master. She knew the Thanksgiving ritual by heart. She had performed it 100 times. The sequence never changed. The heavy linen tablecloth spread first, its fabric starched and pristine. Then the silver candlesticks placed down the center, their candles tall and white. The dishes arranged in precise order. The turkey brought out last, golden and steaming, placed at the center like an offering to gods who did not deserve worship. She knew when the family would sit, knew when their attention would be fully absorbed by the meal, their guards down, their laughter loud, knew the exact moment when no one would be watching the candles too closely. This year, she prepared the table the same way she always had, but this year, she made small adjustments. A candle positioned slightly closer to the table's edge, where a breeze from the window might nudge it. A linen napkin folded and placed where it would brush against the flame if jostled. Cooking grease from the roasting pan left to pool near the centerpiece. An invisible accelerant waiting for a spark. Her face remained perfectly still. Her movements practiced and calm. No one suspected. Why would they? She was Marjorie, the kitchen slave. Silent, obedient, reliable. She had never given them reason to question her compliance. But inside, her mind was arranging the night like ingredients in a recipe. Timing, placement, opportunity. She did not speak her plan aloud, did not confide in a single soul. Some acts of resistance must be carried in the silence between heartbeats, hidden even from those who might understand. She had prepared 100 Thanksgiving tables before, but tonight, she prepared one for burning. The table was perfect. White linen stretched across its length like fresh snow on a grave. Silver gleamed under the warm glow of candlelight. The turkey sat at the center, its skin bronzed and glistening, surrounded by bowls of candied yams, collard greens, swimming in butter, cranberry sauce like drops of blood, cornbread still steaming from the oven. It was a masterpiece, a monument to excess. The master took his seat at the head of the table, his chest swelling with satisfaction. His family gathered around him, wife in silk, children scrubbed and dressed, guests from neighboring plantations, murmuring their admiration. They bowed their heads in prayer, and Marjorie moved through the shadows like smoke. She had timed it perfectly. The candles were burning bright, their flames tall and hungry. The grease she had left near the centerpiece shimmered in the firelight. One small adjustment. A linen napkin shifted just slightly, as if by accident, and the flame caught. It happened faster than anyone expected. The fire spread across the tablecloth like a living thing, devouring the white linen in seconds. Flames crawled toward the centerpiece, licking at the edges of serving dishes, igniting the decorations. The candles toppled, hot wax spilling across the wood and feeding the blaze. Smoke rose thick and black, choking the air. The family shouted. Chairs scraped backward. The master lunged forward, trying to smother the flames with his bare hands. But the fire was already too large, too hungry, too far gone, and then the smoke reached his lungs. He choked, gasped, coughed violently, his face turning red, then pale, as the ashes of his own pride filled his throat and burned his eyes. The dining hall, his theater of dominance, his stage of power, had become a furnace. The abundance he celebrated turned to smoke. The table he loved crumbled to charcoal. The feast became fuel for the flames, and Marjorie stood in the doorway, watching. She did not smile, did not speak. But in that moment, as the master choked on the ashes of his own arrogance, the power had shifted. If this moment sent a chill down your spine, hit that subscribe button, because the aftermath is even darker. In a single breath, celebration became suffocation. The fire was extinguished, but the damage carved into that house would never heal. The dining hall reeked of smoke and charred wood. The once pristine tablecloth was a blackened, twisted ruin. Shattered dishes lay scattered across the floor like broken teeth. The centerpiece, the pride of the master's table, the symbol of his wealth, had collapsed into a pile of ash and melted metal, and the master sat slumped in his chair, still coughing, still tasting smoke and failure in every breath. The family stood frozen in stunned silence, their Thanksgiving feast, their ritual of superiority, reduced to ruins in minutes. Outside, in the quarters and the shadows, the enslaved community had seen the smoke rising. They watched the chaos unfold, with expressions carefully blank, hearts pounding with fear and something they could not name aloud. Shock rippled through them. Fear, certainly. Collective punishment was always a possibility. But beneath that fear, something else flickered, something dangerous, hidden admiration. The faintest spark of hope that power was not as absolute as it seemed. The fire had done more than destroy furniture. It had shattered the illusion of control that the master's authority depended on. For years, he had ruled Willow Creek with unquestioned dominance. His word was law. His table was the physical manifestation of that law, a place where power was displayed, reinforced, and worshipped with every meal. But now that table was gone, consumed, erased, and everyone in the house knew it. The master's rage came quickly, but it was laced with something unfamiliar, desperation. He bellowed orders, demanded answers. His voice echoed through the house, shrill and urgent, trying to reassert the dominance the flames had stolen from him. The enslaved were gathered, lined up, watched with suspicion. Fear spread through the quarters like frost. Everyone knew what came next. When the master's pride was wounded, someone always paid the price. Collective punishment was a tool of terror. Beat one, terrify them all. But finding the truth was harder than the master expected, because Marjorie had moved like smoke, silent, invisible. And even now, standing among the others, her face remained a mask of perfect compliance. Comment below if you've ever heard a story this haunting, because Marjorie's silence was her greatest weapon. The table was gone, but the meaning of its ashes had only begun to settle. Thanksgiving turned into an inquisition. The master paced the grounds like a man possessed, his voice hoarse from smoke and fury. He needed someone to blame, someone to punish. The destruction of his table was not merely a loss of property, it was humiliation. His guests had witnessed his authority collapse in real time. That could not stand unanswered. The enslaved were gathered in the cold November air, their breath forming clouds of fear. Questions fired like accusations. Who had been near the candles? Who had prepared the table? Who had lit the fires in the hearth? Marjorie stood among them, her hands folded, her face still as stone. She did not flinch, did not tremble. She had survived decades on this plantation by learning how to become invisible, and now that skill was her armor. The master's gaze swept over her, lingering for a moment that stretched like pulled thread, then moved on. He wanted a confession, needed someone to break under the weight of his interrogation, so he could restore the order the fire had disrupted. Punishment was theater on plantations, meant to be seen, to remind everyone of their place. But no one spoke. The silence itself became an act of resistance. The plantation system operated on fear, the constant, suffocating threat of violence. But fear only works when people believe that compliance will save them. And the fire had proven something dangerously subversive, that even in the most controlled spaces, under the tightest surveillance, rebellion was possible. The master's authority had always rested on the illusion of absolute power, but illusions are fragile, and fire burns them away. Days crawled past. The interrogations continued, growing more erratic. The master punished randomly, hoping that fear would force the truth into the light, like blood squeezed from a wound. But the truth remained hidden, because Marjorie had left no trail, no witnesses, no confession to extract. The master could rebuild his table, could buy new dishes, new linens, new candles to replace what had been destroyed, but he could never rebuild what the fire had actually taken from him: the certainty of his control. Share this video if you believe. Forgotten acts of resistance deserve to be remembered, but the fire had already spoken louder than any confession. Marjorie's fire was not unique in the history of slavery. It was one thread in a vast, hidden tapestry of resistance. Throughout the centuries of American slavery, enslaved people fought back in countless ways. Some resisted openly, rebellions that history recorded in blood and legislation, but most resistance happened in the shadows. Tools broken deliberately, work slowed to a crawl, crops sabotaged, food poisoned, fields burned under cover of night. Acts of defiance that would never appear in official records, but would be whispered about for generations. The burning of the Thanksgiving table became one of those whispers. It was more than arson. It was symbolic annihilation. The table represented everything the master valued: wealth, status, the performance of civilization built on brutality. It was where he displayed his power, where guests admired his success, where his family gathered to congratulate themselves on their superiority. To destroy it was to strike at the very heart of plantation mythology. Enslaved cooks occupied a strange, dangerous position in the hierarchy. They were forced into intimacy with their instructors, preparing meals, serving food, existing in spaces where masters felt comfortable and unguarded. But that intimacy also granted them access, knowledge, opportunity. Marjorie had used that opportunity in doing so. She had reclaimed a fragment of agency in a system specifically designed to crush individuality and resistance. For one moment, in that smoke-filled dining hall, she had seized control. The fire became a reminder, for the enslaved and the enslavers both, that control was never as absolute as it appeared, that even in the most monitored, most oppressive spaces, resistance could spark to life. The master could rebuild, could replace, could try to erase the memory of that night. But he could not silence the whispers, could not erase the knowledge that his table, his throne, had been reduced to ashes by a woman he believed was powerless. If this part shook you, subscribe. The conclusion will leave you haunted. Long after the ashes cooled, people still whispered about the Thanksgiving that swallowed its master whole. Centuries have passed since that Thanksgiving night at Willow Creek Plantation. The house may no longer stand. The fields may have been reclaimed by forest. The names of the master's family likely lost to time, remembered by no one. But Marjorie's fire still burns. It burns because it speaks to something that transcends one woman's anger, one moment of revenge, one act of defiance. It speaks to the courage required to resist when every system around you is designed to convince you that resistance is impossible. Marjorie's fire was not heroic in the way Hollywood imagines heroism. There were no dramatic speeches, no armies rallying behind her, no declarations of independence written on parchment. There was only a woman, a table, and a flame. But that flame carried weight. It reminded the enslaved that they were not powerless. It reminded the enslavers that their authority was built on sand. It reminded history that acts of resistance do not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they come in whispers, in shadows, in moments so small they seem insignificant until they ignite. Marjorie's story is part of a larger, often invisible history, A history of people who fought for their dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Some fought openly and were crushed. Others fought in secret and survived. But all of them carved their defiance into the bones of history, whether their names were remembered or not. The Thanksgiving table at Willow Creek burned because Marjorie refused to remain invisible, because she understood that some symbols of oppression must be destroyed, not endured, because she chose fire over submission. Her act reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that courage does not always look like we expect it to, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a sword but the refusal to keep building monuments to your own oppression. Empires forget their crimes, histories fade, rewritten by the victors, but fire leaves its own record, burned into wood, etched into memory, impossible to erase completely, and Marjorie's flames carved her story into the heart of Willow Creek forever, a permanent scar on the face of a system that believed it could own human souls. Her fire still burns, and we remember. If this story moved you, like this video and share it, because stories like Marjorie's deserve to be told until every ash has been accounted for.